August 7th, 1942, 0641 hours. The northern edge of the Lunga River, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Captain Sarah Mitchell crouched behind a rotting mahogany log, her fingers wrapped around the stock of her M1 Garand rifle. Through the dense canopy above, morning light filtered in broken shafts, illuminating a jungle so thick that visibility extended barely 15 yards in any direction. The air hung heavy with moisture, every breath tasting of decay and vegetation. Somewhere in that green maze, Japanese soldiers were moving. She could hear them, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sounds that didn't belong to the jungle's natural rhythm. What the Japanese Imperial Army was about to discover would shatter every assumption they held about American soldiers. The Americans weren't supposed to know how to fight in jungles. They were city boys, factory workers, farmers from open plains. Yet, in the next 72 hours, Captain Mitchell and thousands of Marines like her would demonstrate a mastery of jungle warfare that would terrify Japanese veterans who had conquered Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. The screams that would soon echo through Guadalcanal's rainforest would mark the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific, driven back by an enemy that had learned to turn the jungle itself into a weapon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Japanese military entered the Pacific War with absolute confidence in their jungle warfare superiority. This confidence wasn't baseless arrogance, but the product of victories that had shocked the world. Between December 1941 and May 1942, Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia with the speed that military analysts had deemed impossible. They had conquered Malaya in 70 days, captured the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, overrun the Philippines, and driven British forces from Burma. Every victory had been won in jungle terrain against opponents who had controlled those territories for decades. The Japanese soldier, according to their own propaganda and Western military analysis, was the ultimate jungle fighter. Trained in harsh conditions, capable of surviving on minimal rations, willing to endure any hardship, the Japanese infantrymen had proven superior to British, Dutch, and American forces in every jungle engagement of the war's first 6 months. Japanese training manuals emphasized adaptation to tropical environments. Soldiers learned to move silently through dense vegetation, to use terrain for concealment, to fight effectively in conditions where visibility rarely exceeded 20 yards. They trained in malaria-infested swamps, practiced river crossings under fire, and learned to construct hidden positions that were virtually undetectable. The curriculum at the Imperial Army Infantry School included extensive jungle warfare modules developed from experiences in China and Indochina. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, who would lead the first major counterattack on Guadalcanal, had trained his soldiers specifically for jungle combat. His regiment had spent months in tropical environments, learning techniques that had proven successful throughout Southeast Asia. They practiced night infiltration through dense vegetation, perfected the art of silent movement, and trained in close-quarters combat where the jungle's limited visibility gave advantage to soldiers willing to engage at bayonet range. The Japanese believed they understood everything about jungle warfare. They were confident that any American force foolish enough to challenge them in tropical terrain would be destroyed through superior jungle craft, better adaptation to harsh conditions, and willingness to endure hardships that would break Western soldiers. This confidence would prove to be their first fatal mistake. What the Japanese didn't understand was that the United States Marine Corps had been preparing for Pacific jungle warfare since the 1920s. While Japanese forces gained practical experience in China and Southeast Asia, American military planners had been developing doctrine, training programs, and tactical innovations specifically designed for island warfare in tropical environments. The Marines had established jungle warfare training centers in Panama, Nicaragua, and other Central American locations. Officers studied reports from British experiences in Malaya, analyzed Japanese tactics in China, and developed counter-strategies. They understood that fighting in jungles required completely different approaches than conventional warfare in Europe. American jungle warfare doctrine emphasized several revolutionary concepts that contradicted traditional military thinking. First, small unit initiative became paramount. In terrain where companies could become separated by mere hundreds of yards of dense vegetation, individual squad leaders needed authority to make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from battalion headquarters. Second, the Marines developed what they called aggressive patrolling, a technique that turned the jungle from a defensive barrier into an offensive weapon. Rather than waiting in fixed positions for enemy attacks, Marine patrols would penetrate deep into Japanese-held territory, gather intelligence, ambush supply lines, and create constant psychological pressure. Third, and most importantly, the Marines understood that jungle warfare was fundamentally about information dominance. Whoever controlled intelligence about enemy positions, movements, and intentions would control the battlefield, regardless of numerical superiority. These concepts were tested and refined in training exercises throughout 1941 and early 1942. By the time Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they had absorbed lessons that Japanese forces, despite their victories, had never fully grasped. The Japanese had won their previous jungle battles through superior physical endurance and willingness to accept casualties. The Americans were about to demonstrate that jungle warfare was actually about superior intelligence, better tactics, and systematic application of firepower. Captain Sarah Mitchell embodied this new approach to jungle combat. A former school teacher from Oregon, she had joined the Marine Corps in 1940, driven by a conviction that war with Japan was inevitable. Her background in biology gave her an unusual advantage in understanding jungle environments. She saw the rainforest not as an obstacle, but as a complex ecosystem that could be studied, understood, and exploited. During training at Camp Lejeune, Mitchell had distinguished herself in navigation exercises, consistently outperforming male officers who relied on traditional map and compass techniques. She had developed intuitive understanding of terrain, learning to read the jungle through subtle indicators that others missed. The way vines grew indicated water sources. The density of undergrowth revealed animal trails that could be used for movement. The sounds of birds and insects provided early warning of enemy presence. Her superiors recognized these talents and assigned her to lead reconnaissance patrols, small units that would operate independently in Japanese-held territory. These patrols were the cutting edge of American jungle warfare doctrine, gathering intelligence that would guide larger operations. By August 1942, Mitchell had completed over 40 training missions in Central American jungles, learning lessons that she would soon apply against an enemy that had never faced such tactics. The Battle of Guadalcanal began on August 7, 1942, when 11,000 Marines landed on the island's northern coast. Their objective was Henderson Field, an airstrip the Japanese were constructing that would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. The landing caught Japanese forces by surprise, and Marines quickly secured the airfield with minimal resistance. But Japanese commanders, confident in their jungle warfare superiority, immediately planned counterattacks that would drive the Americans back into the sea. The Japanese believed the terrain would be their ally. Guadalcanal's interior was mountainous jungle so dense that entire battalions could be hidden within miles of enemy positions. Rivers ran swift and deep, creating natural barriers. The climate was brutally hot and humid, with frequent torrential rains that turned the jungle floor into swamps. These conditions, Japanese planners assumed, would overwhelm American forces unused to tropical hardships.
Colonel Ichiki's regiment, approximately 917 men, landed east of the marine perimeter on August 18th. His orders were to attack immediately, destroy the American forces, and recapture Henderson Field. Ichiki was supremely confident. His soldiers were veterans of combat in China, trained in jungle warfare, and willing to die for the emperor. The Americans, he believed, were untested troops who would break under determined Japanese assault.
Marine defenders, warned by reconnaissance patrols and guided by radio communications, knew exactly where to concentrate their fire. The battle lasted through the night. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, each assault breaking against prepared American positions. By dawn, over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Only a handful escaped back into the jungle. Colonel Ichiki, facing the destruction of his regiment, committed suicide on the battlefield. The Battle of Alligator Creek, as it came to be known, shattered Japanese confidence in their jungle warfare superiority. For the first time, Japanese soldiers had faced an enemy that fought more effectively in tropical terrain than they did. The Americans hadn't won through superior numbers or firepower alone. They had won through better intelligence, superior tactics, and a fundamental understanding of how to dominate jungle warfare. But this was only the beginning. Over the following months, Marine patrols would venture deeper into Guadalcanal's interior, engaging in a style of warfare that would terrorize Japanese forces and establish American superiority in jungle combat. Captain Mitchell's reconnaissance patrol operated under principles that seemed simple but required extraordinary skill and discipline to execute. First, they moved in absolute silence. Every piece of equipment was secured to prevent noise. Metal items were wrapped in cloth. Canteens were only half filled to eliminate sloshing. Soldiers communicated through hand signals developed specifically for jungle environments. Second, they used the jungle's natural sounds as camouflage. Patrols moved during rain when the drumming of water on leaves masked footsteps. They timed movements to coincide with wind gusts that rustled vegetation. They learned to recognize the alarm calls of birds and would freeze when jungle fowl detected their presence, waiting for the natural soundscape to resume. Third, and most terrifyingly for Japanese forces, American patrols learned to become predators. They would track Japanese units for days, learning their patterns, identifying their routes, and then setting ambushes at moments of maximum vulnerability. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers was devastating. They had expected to be the hunters in the jungle. Instead, they became the hunted. One particular engagement in late August demonstrated the effectiveness of these tactics. Mitchell's patrol had been tracking a Japanese supply column moving through dense rainforest toward their defensive positions in the island's interior. The column consisted of approximately 40 soldiers carrying ammunition and food to forward units. For 3 days, Mitchell's team shadowed the column, staying close enough to monitor their movements but remaining completely undetected. Japanese soldiers, veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, had no idea they were being followed. On the 3rd day, Mitchell identified the perfect ambush location, a narrow trail that ran between 2 steep ridgelines covered in dense undergrowth. The trail was barely 4 feet wide, forcing the Japanese column to move in single file. High ground on both sides provided excellent firing positions, while the thick vegetation would make it nearly impossible for Japanese soldiers to escape once the ambush was triggered.
4 Marines occupied positions along one side of the trail, providing enfilade fire down the length of the enemy column. 2 more Marines positioned themselves at the far end of the kill zone, blocking any retreat. Mitchell and her radio man took position on the opposite ridge from where she could observe the entire ambush area and direct fire. The key to the ambush's success was patience. Mitchell's team waited for over 6 hours, lying motionless in the undergrowth, ignoring insects, heat, and discomfort. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive action, But American jungle warfare training stressed the importance of remaining invisible until the moment of maximum advantage. When the Japanese column entered the kill zone, Mitchell waited until every enemy soldier was within the ambush area before giving the signal to open fire. The initial volley killed more than half the Japanese soldiers in the first 5 seconds. The remaining soldiers, trapped on a narrow trail with dense jungle on both sides and Marines firing from elevated positions, had nowhere to take cover. Some attempted to return fire but couldn't identify their attackers in the thick vegetation. Others tried to flee but ran directly into the blocking position at the trail's end. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. When the firing stopped, all 40 Japanese soldiers were dead or dying. Mitchell's patrol had suffered no casualties and immediately withdrew into the jungle, disappearing before any Japanese reinforcements could arrive. This pattern would be repeated dozens of times across Guadalcanal. Small Marine patrols, operating with near-complete independence, would ambush Japanese units, destroy supply lines, and create an atmosphere of constant terror. Japanese soldiers began to fear moving through the jungle, knowing that American patrols could be anywhere, watching, waiting, preparing to strike. The psychological warfare component of American jungle tactics proved as effective as the physical casualties inflicted. Marines began leaving markers after successful ambushes, small signs that indicated American forces had been present. Sometimes it was simply an American cigarette butt left conspicuously on the trail. Other times it was more elaborate messages, written in Japanese, taunting enemy forces. These psychological operations were designed to create paranoia and fear. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to being the aggressors in jungle warfare, found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, jumping at every sound, unable to distinguish between natural jungle noises and approaching American patrols. Sleep became nearly impossible. Every snap of a twig could be an American scout. Every rustle of leaves might precede an ambush. The constant stress degraded Japanese combat effectiveness far beyond the actual casualties inflicted. Captain Mitchell understood that jungle warfare was fundamentally a battle for psychological dominance. The side that controlled the mental landscape would eventually control the physical battlefield. American patrols were trained not just to kill enemy soldiers, but to create an environment of constant fear that would break Japanese morale. One particularly effective tactic involved what Marines called sound-disciplined harassment. Small patrols would position themselves near Japanese defensive positions at night and create subtle noises that would keep enemy soldiers alert and awake. Not obvious attacks, but barely audible sounds that could be dismissed as natural jungle noises but created cumulative stress over multiple nights.
A small stone thrown to land near a Japanese foxhole. The snap of a twig just outside their perimeter. The brief sound of movement in undergrowth, followed by silence. These sounds force Japanese soldiers to maintain constant vigilance, degrading their effectiveness through sleep deprivation without ever engaging in direct combat. After a week of such harassment, Japanese defensive positions would be manned by exhausted soldiers whose judgment and reflexes were compromised. After American forces launched actual attacks against these positions, they faced enemies who were already psychologically defeated. The Japanese military command recognized they were facing a new kind of warfare, but struggled to develop effective countertactics. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive action, but how could they be aggressive against an enemy they couldn't find? Their training stressed close combat superiority, but American patrols refused to engage in close combat, preferring to strike from concealment and withdraw before Japanese forces could respond. Traditional Japanese tactics of night infiltration and surprise assault proved ineffective because American intelligence networks usually detected Japanese movements before attacks could be launched. The reconnaissance patrols that had seemed like a minor nuisance initially were revealed as the foundation of American jungle warfare superiority. By September 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were effectively trapped in defensive positions, unable to maneuver freely because American patrols dominated the jungle between their strongpoints. Supply lines were constantly ambushed. Reinforcement columns were tracked and destroyed. Communication between Japanese units became nearly impossible without risk of interception or ambush. The Marines had achieved what Japanese commanders had thought impossible. They had turned the jungle, which was supposed to favor Japanese tactics, into an American weapon. Every tree could hide an American scout. Every trail could be an ambush site. Every night brought the possibility of silent death from an enemy that moved like ghosts through terrain the Japanese had considered their domain. Captain Mitchell's patrol achieved a reputation that spread through Japanese defensive positions. Enemy soldiers began calling her unit the Forest Demons, Americans who could appear and disappear without trace, who killed without warning and vanished before any response was possible. Japanese commanders offered rewards for information about this unit, but no Japanese soldier who encountered Mitchell's patrol survived to provide intelligence. The reality was less supernatural than the mythology suggested. Mitchell's success came from rigorous application of techniques developed through years of training and refined through constant practice. Her patrol used every advantage that systematic preparation could provide, from carefully maintained equipment to detailed intelligence about Japanese positions and movements. They understood that jungle warfare wasn't about being tougher or braver than the enemy. It was about being better prepared, more disciplined, and more systematic in applying tactical principles. The Japanese relied on individual soldiers' endurance and fighting spirit. The Americans relied on superior doctrine, better training, and systematic approach to warfare.
By conventional standards, they were executing a textbook patrol, yet Mitchell's team had been shadowing them for 18 hours without being detected once. The difference lay in systematic application of fieldcraft versus reliance on individual alertness. The Japanese patrol moved during daylight, assuming that visibility would help them detect threats. Mitchell's team moved primarily during periods of reduced visibility, dawn, dusk, and heavy rain, when their movements were harder to detect. The Japanese maintained verbal communication, speaking in low voices they believed were inaudible at distance. Mitchell's team used only hand signals, understanding that sound carried unpredictably in jungle environments. The Japanese officer leading the patrol was experienced and competent, but he was executing tactics designed for a different kind of warfare. His training emphasized what to do when contact occurred, how to return fire effectively, how to maneuver under fire, how to press attacks aggressively. Mitchell's training emphasized how to avoid contact until the moment of her choosing, how to gather intelligence without being detected, how to position forces for overwhelming advantage before engaging. When Mitchell finally decided to engage, she chose a moment when the Japanese patrol had stopped for a rest break in what they believed was a secure position. They had formed a defensive perimeter, posted guards, and were eating cold rations. By their doctrine, they had done everything correctly. What they hadn't done was detect the 8 Marines who had occupied elevated positions around their perimeter over the previous 2 hours, moving so slowly and carefully that even experienced Japanese soldiers never noticed their presence. Mitchell's ambush killed 17 Japanese soldiers in the initial volley. The 3 survivors attempted to flee, but were cut down before they traveled 20 yards. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Mitchell's patrol then withdrew, moving through a pre-planned escape route they had identified hours earlier, leaving no trace of their presence except the bodies of enemy soldiers. This engagement, like dozens of others across Guadalcanal, demonstrated the fundamental difference between Japanese and American approaches to jungle warfare. The Japanese had trained their soldiers to be individually tough, capable of enduring hardships, willing to fight aggressively when contact occurred. The Americans had trained their soldiers to be systematically superior, to control the terms of engagement, to strike only when victory was assured, and to withdraw before the enemy could respond effectively. Japanese commanders reviewing reports of these engagements struggled to understand what they were facing. Their soldiers were brave, experienced, and well-trained according to Japanese doctrine, yet they were being systematically destroyed by American patrols that seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and disappear before any counterattack could be organized. The answer lay in a fundamental philosophical difference about what jungle warfare meant. To the Japanese military, jungle warfare was about soldiers adapting to harsh environments and fighting effectively despite difficult conditions. To the American Marines, jungle warfare was about making the environment itself a weapon, using terrain, weather, vegetation, and limited visibility as tactical advantages rather than obstacles to overcome.
This difference extended to every aspect of operations. Japanese supply lines followed established trails because moving supplies cross-country through dense jungle was extremely difficult. American patrols, knowing that Japanese forces would use these trails, could ambush supply columns with devastating effectiveness. Japanese defensive positions were constructed according to traditional military engineering principles, with clear fields of fire and strong fortifications. American scouts, moving through terrain the Japanese considered impassable, could observe these positions from angles the defenders never anticipated and identify vulnerabilities invisible to frontal assault. Japanese communications relied on radio and messenger, both vulnerable to interdiction in jungle terrain. American forces developed a network of native scouts from Guadalcanal's indigenous population, people who knew every trail, every water source, every piece of terrain on the island, and could provide intelligence that no amount of reconnaissance could duplicate. The Coast Watchers, Australian and British colonial officials who had remained on Pacific Islands after Japanese occupation, provided another intelligence advantage the Japanese couldn't counter. These observers, working with native allies and equipped with powerful radios, could report Japanese ship movements, aircraft flights, and troop dispositions in real time. Captain Mitchell's operations benefited enormously from this intelligence network. Before launching patrols into Japanese-held territory, she would receive briefings that included information from native scouts about enemy positions, reports from coast watchers about Japanese reinforcements, and intelligence gathered by previous patrols. This comprehensive picture allowed her to plan operations with knowledge of enemy dispositions that Japanese commanders could only dream of having about American forces. The Japanese attempted to develop their own intelligence networks but faced insurmountable obstacles. The indigenous population of Guadalcanal had suffered under Japanese occupation and overwhelmingly supported the Americans. Japanese soldiers who ventured outside their defensive perimeters were often reported to American forces by native observers. Japanese attempts to recruit local guides usually failed, and in several cases, guides who agreed to work for Japanese forces actually led them into American ambushes. This intelligence disparity meant that American forces operated with near-complete knowledge of Japanese positions and movements, while Japanese forces stumbled blindly through terrain where every local resident was a potential American intelligence source. The psychological impact of this imbalance was profound. Japanese soldiers began to feel that the jungle itself was hostile, that the Americans possessed supernatural knowledge of their movements. In reality, it was simply superior intelligence gathering combined with systematic exploitation of that intelligence. By November 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had transitioned from offensive operations aimed at recapturing Henderson Field to desperate defensive efforts focused on survival. American patrols had established such complete dominance of the jungle that Japanese units could no longer maneuver freely. Reinforcement attempts were detected and ambushed.
Supply operations became nearly impossible. Communication between Japanese defensive positions broke down as messengers were intercepted and radio communications were targeted by American artillery based on direction-finding equipment. The Battle of Mount Austin, which began in late December 1942 and continued into January 1943, demonstrated the complete reversal of jungle warfare superiority. Japanese forces had constructed elaborate defensive positions on the mountain slopes, positions they believed were virtually impregnable due to the terrain's difficulty. The approaches were steep, covered in dense jungle, and seemingly impossible to attack without suffering catastrophic casualties. Captain Mitchell's reconnaissance patrol spent 3 weeks mapping these defenses, moving through terrain the Japanese considered impassable, identifying every bunker, every fighting position, every supply cache. Her team discovered that the Japanese defensive positions, while strong from frontal approaches, were vulnerable from the steep ridgelines above them, approaches the defenders had dismissed as too difficult for American forces to use. When the American attack finally came, it didn't follow the routes Japanese defenders had prepared to defend. Instead, Marine infantry climbed the steep ridges Mitchell had identified, moving through supposedly impassable terrain to attack Japanese positions from directions the defenders never anticipated. Japanese soldiers, facing attacks from unexpected angles, found their carefully prepared defenses were oriented in the wrong directions. The psychological impact of being attacked from terrain they believed was impassable shattered Japanese morale. If Americans could appear from impossible directions, then no position was truly safe. The paranoia this created made Japanese defensive operations increasingly difficult as soldiers worried about threats from every direction rather than focusing on obvious approach routes. The battle from Mount Austin lasted 3 weeks and resulted in the destruction of Japanese defensive positions that commanders had believed could hold for months. The victory wasn't achieved through superior numbers or firepower, though Americans had advantages in both. It was achieved through superior reconnaissance, better understanding of terrain, and systematic application of intelligence to battlefield operations. Japanese commanders, writing reports to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, struggled to explain their defeats.
They couldn't admit that American forces had proven superior in jungle warfare because this contradicted fundamental assumptions about Japanese military superiority. Instead, they blamed defeats on insufficient supplies, lack of naval support, and bad luck. Anything except the uncomfortable truth that American Marines had simply outfought them in terrain where Japanese forces had expected to dominate. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal would shape American operations throughout the Pacific War. The reconnaissance patrol tactics pioneered by officers like Captain Mitchell became standard procedure. The emphasis on intelligence gathering before operations became Marine Corps doctrine. The understanding that jungle terrain was a weapon to be exploited rather than an obstacle to overcome transformed American approaches to island warfare. Japanese forces, meanwhile, never fully adapted to the new reality. Their tactical doctrine remained rooted in beliefs about spiritual superiority and aggressive offense that had become obsolete in the face of American systematic warfare. They continued to emphasize individual soldier toughness over unit-level tactical sophistication. They persisted in believing that willpower could overcome material disadvantages, even as mounting casualties proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. Captain Mitchell survived the Guadalcanal campaign and went on to train new reconnaissance units, passing on the techniques she had developed through months of combat operations. Her training emphasized the fundamental principles that had proven successful in jungle warfare. First, patience trumped aggression. The side willing to wait for perfect conditions before engaging would usually win engagements against forces that attacked impulsively. Second, intelligence was more valuable than firepower. Knowing where the enemy was located and what they were doing was more important than having superior weapons. A small force with complete intelligence could defeat a larger force operating blindly. Third, the jungle was neutral. It favored neither side inherently, but rewarded the side that better understood how to exploit its characteristics. Visibility limitations, difficult terrain, and harsh conditions affected both sides equally. Victory went to the force that turned these challenges into tactical advantages. Fourth, psychological dominance was achievable through systematic operations. Creating an environment where enemy forces felt constantly threatened, never safe, always watched, would degrade their effectiveness more surely than inflicting casualties. These principles, learned through bitter experience on Guadalcanal, became the foundation of American jungle warfare doctrine for the remainder of the war. They were taught at training schools, incorporated into field manuals, and practiced by every Marine unit deploying to the Pacific. The transformation was complete. American forces, which had entered the war with virtually no jungle warfare experience, had become the world's most effective jungle fighters within a year. The Japanese, who had begun the war confident in their jungle warfare superiority, found themselves outmatched by an enemy that had approached jungle warfare as a problem to be solved through systematic analysis rather than a test of individual endurance to be overcome through willpower.
The ability to operate effectively in jungle terrain meant that no Japanese-held island was truly secure. American forces could land, establish beachheads, and then penetrate inland through terrain Japanese commanders had assumed would limit American operations to coastal areas. This capability forced Japanese defensive planning to account for threats from unexpected directions, diluting their defensive strength and making every position vulnerable. The strategic impact was profound. Islands that Japanese planners had believed could be held for months or years fell in weeks because American forces could maneuver through jungle terrain that was supposed to protect Japanese defensive positions. Supply lines that Japanese commanders had assumed were secure because they ran through supposedly impassable jungle were constantly ambushed by American patrols that moved through that terrain with ease. The mythology that had sustained Japanese confidence, the belief that Japanese soldiers were inherently superior jungle fighters, collapsed under the weight of repeated defeats. By 1943, Japanese soldiers no longer entered jungle combat with confidence in their superiority. Instead, they feared American patrols that seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish before counterattacks could be organized. This fear was rational, based on accumulated experience that American forces controlled jungle environments more effectively than Japanese forces ever had. The transformation of American military capability in jungle warfare represented one of the most remarkable adaptations in military history. In less than a year, the United States Marine Corps had evolved from a force with minimal jungle warfare experience into the world's most effective jungle fighting force. This transformation wasn't achieved through superior individual soldiers or better equipment. It was achieved through superior doctrine, systematic training, and willingness to learn from experience. Captain Sarah Mitchell, receiving a Navy Cross for her reconnaissance operations on Guadalcanal, represented thousands of Marines who had mastered jungle warfare through dedication to systematic tactical excellence. Her citation mentioned specific engagements, but her real contribution was demonstrating that jungle warfare could be mastered through intellectual rigor and tactical discipline rather than physical toughness alone. The Japanese soldiers who had terrorized British, Dutch, and American forces in the war's early months had discovered a terrible truth. Jungle warfare wasn't about who could endure more hardship or who possessed greater fighting spirit. It was about who better understood how to gather intelligence, plan operations systematically, and exploit terrain advantages. On these measures, American forces had proven decisively superior. The legacy of Guadalcanal's jungle warfare extended throughout the Pacific War and beyond. Every subsequent island campaign benefited from the lessons learned in those first desperate months. The techniques of reconnaissance patrolling, systematic intelligence gathering, and patient tactical execution became standard American military practice. Future generations of soldiers studying jungle warfare would learn from the Guadalcanal experience, understanding that success in difficult terrain comes not from individual heroics, but from systematic application of sound tactical principles. The jungle that had seemed so intimidating in August 1942 had become, by February 1943, an American weapon.
The transformation from intimidation to mastery represented not just tactical evolution but philosophical understanding. The jungle wasn't an enemy to be overcome through willpower. It was an environment to be understood and exploited through systematic study and disciplined application of knowledge. Japanese forces, trapped in a military culture that valued spiritual power over systematic analysis, never made this philosophical transition. They continued fighting jungle warfare as a test of individual endurance rather than a challenge requiring systematic tactical solutions. This failure to adapt, more than any shortage of supplies or lack of reinforcements, explains their defeat on Guadalcanal and every subsequent jungle battlefield. The Americans had learned to fight smarter. The Japanese continued fighting harder. In modern warfare, fighting smarter wins. The terrified screams of Japanese soldiers ambushed by patrols they never detected, dying in jungles they thought they controlled, marked not just tactical defeats, but the collapse of an entire military philosophy that had proven obsolete in the face of systematic American warfare.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.